Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Galactic Civilizations 3. This is going to be our video in retrospective, and I did actually do the recording of the game on Genius level difficulty, and I found out that the AI in this game is really quite easy on that difficulty, so I did it again on Godlike, which is much harder, but at the same time, I did complete that one. I found out this game isn't actually too difficult so long as you're willing to abuse certain mechanics to it, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the review here. But I also wanted to say why I'm not going to be posting out those videos. While I had a really fun time playing it through the game on Genius difficulty and on Godlike difficulty, this is a really fun game to play. I didn't find this to be an interesting game to watch when I was sort of going through to edit this and look through it a little bit. And this is kind of the reason why I didn't buy this game in the first place. It took me until there was a really deep Steam sale on this game before I considered buying it, because I've watched other people play this game, and I've heard other people talking about it very limited, in a very limited sense there. And this game is not fun to play. Sorry, not fun to watch. This game is fun to play. There are certain elements to the game design that could be fixed to make it more exciting to watch and to play, and especially on the higher difficulties, it is very, very dull to watch, I find. So I think that there are things that they could do to increase the watchability of this game, but at the same time, that's not really necessarily the goal of a game. It is not necessarily to be watched, it's to be played by the person who's going to buy it. So anyway, let's jump into the guts of this a little bit here. So I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, by comparing this, of course, to Stellaris and Endless Space 2. And the reason I'm doing this is because this will give you a really great trifecta of different games in the genre that you could try out, and you'll sort of know which one you want to get based on that if this sort of genre appeals to you. And obviously, if you're not into 4X space games, then why the hell are you listening about any of these, really? So in any event, let's go ahead and start talking, first of all, about the customizer here, because that, of course, is the first thing you sort of get into. So let's go ahead and take a look at the faction that I've created here and sort of the elements to it. This really goes into the deep dive of lore and background and creating your own personalized faction in a great way that I quite like. You can enter descriptions. I don't bother with that because all the descriptions for everything are in my head. The backstory and everything like that is in my head because this is something that I played in other D&D games and so on and so forth. It lets you edit the type of star system that you start off with, which is really nice. It lets you name that. And it allows for a lot of personalized customization. You can get quite detailed pictures and stuff like that uploaded. I just used the default for the Terran Rebels, but you can potentially upload something. I just have no artistic talent, so I didn't bother. And here's the actual guts of the system here. This is where the numbers actually come into play. And the numbers in the traits system do matter to a certain degree, but some are obviously more important than others, and I think that it could be rebalanced just a little bit there. I find that most of these numbers really don't make a humongous difference to the operation of a faction. The ones that really make a big difference are things like Observant, Fast, and Organized. Those ones are the ability to scout faster and have larger fleets, and even Organized is only sometimes useful. There are plenty of times where you're realistically never going to reach your logistics cap. So having an extra 6 points of logistics does not necessarily matter. The other one that really makes a difference is Likeable. If you're fully likable and play a certain way, you'll basically never end up in a war, unless you're up against the Drengi or something like that. And if you're at fully unlikable, then you're going to have everyone declaring war on you, including the pacifist factions, really quickly. So the likability of your faction could almost be seen as an alternate to the difficulty slider. And if you really want a harder experience, you could go full unlikable. The real meat of what defines your faction, though, is in the civilization abilities. In this particular case, I've got the Ancient and Knowledgeable traits here, or abilities, and the combination of these lets you have a really, really powerful type of ship there, because Knowledgeable gives you the highest amount of extra mass that a ship can carry, so more weapons, more armor, more of everything. And Ancient allows you to sort of have a bit of that, as well as a cheaper upkeep, so you don't have to pay those high costs, and has a bunch of other ship-related bonuses. You could also go something like Knowledgeable Warriors. I think the really important one is Knowledgeable. The other playthrough I did, I had Vigilant and Bureaucrats, and that let me have lots of star ports. I can't remember what they're called right off the top of my head right now, but the star bases or whatever, and have them be a little bit more meaningful as a buff depositor. And that's a perfectly viable way to play the game and perfectly interesting way to play the game. And you can do a lot of different combinations of these things and end up with really interesting types of playthroughs based on what you pick here. And this also sort of influences the settings in the game that you're going to want to play there. If I wanted to go with Colonizer Adaptable, for example, I would want to make sure that I had a game set where there were plenty of planets to colonize that were uninhabitable normally. And that would sort of give me access to that kind of stuff a little bit faster. And yeah, this is really just a great system. I think that there are tons of different ways to play the game based around these different ability combinations and have a different and unique playthrough experience each time. The race type, I haven't found this really that relevant. Synthetic, of course, allows you to just go onto whatever planet you want, which is really broken certain times. You obviously wouldn't really need Adaptable with that. Aquatic can also go onto aquatic planets, which is pretty limited. I've only seen a very, very small number of those as I've played this game. But more importantly, it allows you to improve a small number of tiles, which means that you can get a slightly better planet. Carbon-based has access to Brindle Survey, which is a thing that gives you an extra planet outright. And then there's Silicon-based, which I haven't really played or checked out very much of, but they seem like they probably work similarly to Carbon-based. I don't really know, though. And then there's your starting units. I find that, unfortunately, there's really little reason to not just get the 2 constructors. If you see a colonizable world really early on, you can reconvert one of your constructors into a colony ship and have it move over there anyway for a relatively small amount of money and for no extra admin or anything like that. So it might as well just be the one that you pick, generally speaking. A survey ship could potentially be useful under certain circumstances. In a colony ship, I would almost never really pick that one. But the advantage of picking the colony ship is that you do come with slightly more population that way. Anyway, how do I compare this to the other 2 games? Well, Stellaris, I think, still is the king of focus of faction customization. It has the most broad and most characterful faction generator out of any of the games that I've played so far, allowing you to go really deep into who they are, their politics. This is a little bit more loose and freeform in terms of what you're allowed to pick and combine, but Stellaris's does add a lot more depth and breadth to what you're sort of allowed to do to sort of jostle your faction in one direction or another. This one's a little bit more free as well in terms of the points. It does have a few more things that, broadly speaking, are not too meaningful in terms of like the traits and stuff like that. But yeah, the abilities don't feel like they're as integral to the game itself as, for example, the politics system in Stellaris. Endless Space 2, I think that the factions as they're designed in Endless Space 2 are too custom tailored to the game to really allow for the customizer to shine, because the individual factions themselves are so characterful and so well integrated with their abilities. Just throwing those abilities into a screen like this does not really work. By contrast, the factions in this, while they're fully realized in their own sort of way, are really not that meaningfully fleshed out in the same way that, for example, like the Vodiani or the Riftborn are in Endless Space 2. And because of that, you're able to throw in all of these traits and just have them sort of mixed together hodgepodge without it really affecting the game too badly. By contrast, though, this game does have some of the weaker pre-made factions. I think that Stellaris actually has weaker factions than even this one, so it goes on that sort of spectrum. Either you've got really strong pre-made factions that have a lot of character, a lot of thought put into them, and really differentiated abilities. Like, there's nothing comparable to the differences in factions in the Civilization abilities listed down here. As meaningful as these are, they're still more similar to one another than the bonuses and differences that you see in Endless Space 2. And then, of course, in Stellaris, the factions are really, really boring. The pre-made factions are really boring. It's all about the customizable factions that you can create for yourself. This falls a little bit in between. I think that you could play one of the pre-made factions, but they all seem pretty boring to me personally. And the customizer is good enough to get the job done, but isn't really as fantastic as Stellaris is. And it does give you a little bit of both sort of worlds there in a certain sense there. In terms of the actual game itself, you can go through the options menus here, and this does give you a pretty decent number of ways to change up the game in ways that I think are quite useful. I'll talk about the difficulty here a little bit. I would recommend playing this game from the range of normal to genius, depending on how hard you want the game to be. I don't think that Incredible or Godlike are fun playthroughs, even though I do not think that the AI is necessarily too difficult to defeat on Godlike. I think you will be able to defeat the AI on Godlike. It's just not a very fun playthrough, so I would highly recommend against that. We're going to have this set to normal right now. Now, when I was talking about this earlier, I was also saying, like, one of the things you can do in this game is you can set the extreme planet frequency to various amounts, and it sort of defaults to rare or uncommon or something like that. I can't really remember, but you can set this to abundant and set the habitable planet frequency to rare. And what this will do is it'll make it so that you've got the ability to get these extreme planets. If you're playing as a synthetic race, that means you can colonize those extreme planets when no one else can. Whereas normally, if you're trying to crawl through the text to get to whatever, if you're trying to crawl through those texts, you're not going to be able to. So this is another way that you could try and manipulate the difficulty of the game, is through this options menu, because of the way that planets are colonized. And the interesting thing about this is that if you make sure that all of the other competing races, your opponents here, are either, I think, silicon-based, carbon-based, or aquatic, and you get rid of like the Ur Singularity here. I think there's other groups that you want to get rid of. I think you have to get... No, actually... I can't remember. There's... probably get rid of like the Taurians as well, I guess. But anyway, you get rid of any of the factions that can colonize planets really easily, and then you set it so that you're playing against the godlike AI. And this is going to let you get that advantage of being able to colonize a whole bunch of planets before they're able to colonize them. And this is a good way to balance out the AI's difficulty, because when you're on godlike difficulty, the reason it's frustrating and not fun to play is because the AI has so many bonuses that they're going to colonize every planet in the galaxy before you even get like your shoes on. So it's not really a particularly fun style playthrough when you're that hemmed in that early on and trying to tear your way back up from the bottom for the entire game. So you can manipulate the game in that sort of way. The options in that sense, I think, are really great. They can offer you such a breadth of experience that it can really manipulate even the janky difficulties that the AI is represented with. And in that sort of sense there, if you are going for that kind of playthrough where you've chosen a synthetic life form and you want to play on godlike difficulty to make it so that the AI is a little bit more competitive, because the AI is very uncompetitive, putting it up so that you've got lots of extreme planets and you've only got a few habitable planets is a great way to sort of counterbalance that out there. The way that I personally did it was I played a carbon-based one. I put it to no extreme planets, so they couldn't get that advantage there, and I set habitable planet frequency to rare so that we were all sort of screwed in terms of planets and playing from an even playing field of screwed. So that worked out actually pretty well for me. Anyway, the gameplay settings in this game I think are actually pretty good. I do wish there was a little bit more explanation, and I do wish, for example, that I was capable of taking it so that there was no extra habitable planets. That would actually help out a little bit more. I would also like it if the numbers for these were a little bit more clear. It's hard to tell exactly what they mean with a lot of these numbers, and when I load into a lot of games, it's like, yeah, I said it's a super like frequent habitable planet. I kind of wish that like there was an option in this game to reduce randomization at the screen here. So there are a couple things that I wish they would fix, but for the most part, this is a really good example of a galaxy setting sort of map there. Anyway, I'll jump into a game real quick here. We're not going to actually play through it. I'm just going to show you a couple of the other elements to this game and talk about them. So first of all, I can talk about the music in this game and the sound effects, and compare it, of course, to the others, but the sound effects and music in this game I kind of ignore. I play this game on a very low music setting, and the sound effects are still there, but I have them a little bit muted, so I can listen to other things while I'm playing this game, and that's because this doesn't have the most amazing soundtrack. I think Stellaris's was a little bit better than this one, honestly. It's a pretty good ambient soundtrack. I don't even think this one works as ambient soundtrack. It's just too boring. Of course, if I'm going to talk about these three games, Endless Space 2 obviously has by far the best music. It's not even a contest sort of situation there. If we were to compare these, like, it really just is a case of Endless Space has the best soundtrack, and I think that that's perfectly fair. It's the only one that I play without listening to other music. But this Grand 4X strategy type of game is the exact sort of system where you're really, I feel, expected or you want to play other music while it's going on in the background. I don't really feel like this kind of game is the genre game where you really necessarily are going to be wanting to listen to the soundtrack, simply because you're going to be playing it for a really long time. And because of that, I don't necessarily think that you're gonna get tired of any soundtrack over the course of one of these playthroughs, considering how damn long it is. So I think that it having a relatively boring soundtrack and not the best sound effects either is not the worst thing in the world. It's not going to ruin your playthrough. It's not going to ruin your experience. It's not going to do too much. Like I said, just turn your favorite playlist on YouTube or whatever and have a good time that way. I think that that's a much more reasonable way to sort of approach these types of games. The in-battle soundtrack as well, I think, is a little bit bland. I don't think that the sound effects are quite as good, again, as Endless Space 2. I think that it's pretty comparable to Stellaris in terms of the sound effects of the battles. In some ways, I actually almost think that Stellaris has slightly better sound effects for the battles, but it's pretty damn close. I think that they're fairly close to one another. So it's going to come up down to sort of what sort of sound effects you prefer, I think. This has very classical, schlocky sci-fi sound effects, in my opinion, whereas I think Stellaris has a little bit more grounded sounding sounds, but that's going to vary between what you think is realistic sounding, obviously. It's silly space battles. The most realistic one sounds like you put your game on mute and you can't hear anything. So that's kind of the state of things there. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about the graphics of this game. I actually really, really like the way that this game is designed in terms of look. So let's take a look at this over here. So this is our colonizer ship, and this actually is the fully modified version of the ship that you can create in the customizer. Now this is a default ship. Actually, no, this is a custom-made ship. But all the modules, everything, the coloration, the skin, everything appears the way that you set it up in the designer on the main map, and that looks really good. I love that effect. If you've got a bunch of planets, I don't have any here, but if you have a whole bunch of ships stationed at a planet, you can see them buzzing around there. If you customize a big warship, you can zoom in right close to it and look at it, and it'll look exactly as you had constructed. If I look at my orbital factory here, I can actually see the ship that's being designed with that layout that I had put in there in the shipyard. Like, all of these sort of details are really, really good. In fact, I think that the overmap out of all of the games looks by far the best. This is easily the best overmap out of all three of them. If you zoom out further, it turns into an Endless Space 2-like abstraction. You can see very easily the different icons, and it looks sort of like a holographic representation of that particular type of unit. I think that this works really well in both Endless Space 2 and this game for just really easily conveying that information to you. I don't necessarily correlate the different ship types all that easily with the icons, and you just sort of have to get used to it and learn it, but once you do, that's not really too bad. And I do like the fact that it's based not on the shape of your ship, but rather on an archetype. So this symbol here always represents a builder. The problem with this game is that, like, generally a fleet has a whole bunch of different things. Usually it prioritizes which one gets shown effectively, but there's a little lack of clarity of information there. But I don't necessarily think that there's an easy way to represent all the information that a fleet has on the zoomed out thing, so I think that's perfectly fine. You can also figure out a lot more information by hovering over things in that sort of sense there. So generally speaking, I think that this is one of the best of the three in terms of the appearance. Individual ships looks, I think, is a bit stronger in Endless Space 2. The reason that this individual ships can look better in Endless Space 2 is because there's a more coherent design here. If we take a look at this game, I can go into the designer here, and there has to be like these good-looking sort of base chassis here, but they don't have to necessarily fit with the type of the ship all that well. Like, this is a cargo ship, but it really doesn't look like it would be that good at hauling cargo. Like, where the hell would I put all the cargo? Well, that comes from the modules that you throw into it. Same thing for, like, warships here. They look a little bit generic sometimes. Now, the fact that different factions do have different aesthetics to them, like this is the Altarian ship set, there's the Terran ship set, all of those are sort of different skins. They all look quite different from one another. The fact that there's like these little moving parts, there's a lot of things that I do like about the ship design here. But they're not quite as characterful, in my opinion, as the ships from Endless Space 2, where the Vaudiani designs are very dagger-like and they're very dark and they have that sort of unified color scheme and everything. This has to be a little bit more freeform because I can change the colors, I can change the palettes, I can change a lot about these individual ships in terms of their appearance, and because of that, they have to be a little bit more free in terms of how they're supposed to look there. We can take a look, for example, at the comparison here. This is the AI's sort of variant of a colony ship. This is kind of my variant of the colony ship, and you can see they look fairly similar. This is the other version of a colony ship. Like, they all look fairly similar to one another. And despite that, like, this doesn't necessarily have an aesthetic type to it that really matches necessarily the factions' overall aesthetic. If I had access to this, I could look at sort of later ships, but these ships don't really have a unified appearance to the later ships that I also get. There's tons of ships that I end up getting that have a very, very different looking aesthetic, than these types of ships here. These ones look sort of like fat, pudgy tadpoles or something like that, which doesn't really look much like my late game ships. And these things look like, I don't know, like some sort of chopstick rack or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, like despite that, the ships individually look really good. The fact that you do get that sort of unified color scheme at the very least, and the material scheme and all that does make it so that they have some unified elements. I just think that it's impossible for there to be this much customizability and freedom without sacrificing some level of characterization, without forcing the player to come up to that level of detail on their own. And I don't necessarily feel like that's necessarily what you want to do. So I do think that Endless Space 2 has slightly better looking ships as a whole. But I do think this game has really, really good looking ships. I think that looks really, really nice. This game also sort of has to tolerate individual snap points. You can basically put a weapon pretty much wherever the hell you want. If we take a look at this design over here, and click on this hyperdrive, I could put this like hyperdrive over here, which obviously looks stupid, but the game lets you do it. And the game sort of has to compensate for this kind of stuff by making certain things look a little bit more janky than it otherwise would. And because of this, like, it doesn't, again, come across as having that cool, crisp, unified look of adding in the modules to a ship in Endless Space 2, where adding in a module looks really like it belongs there, because that's how they've designed the ships from the ground up, that this type of module goes into this type of slot. This level of freedom comes with the sort of cost that the snap points don't necessarily work quite as well as you would necessarily. Like, the most obvious one is like for the weapons. I feel like they've kind of got an obvious route here of making it so that you look like you're supposed to put a weapon on these sprues here, but it doesn't quite integrate into it. It just sort of snaps onto the top of it. Whereas in like Endless Space 2, it sort of pops out of it. Same thing in Stellaris, since you've got limited you've got limited snap points where weapons are automatically designated to go. It looks more integrated into the overall, whereas this kind of looks like it's been taped on, even though I really feel like that's where the weapon mount should be located. It doesn't quite look right, and there's no way to sort of make it look perfect in this game, I've been finding. You can scale it up or scale it down, and try and fiddle around with this and work on all sorts of different things to make it look a little bit better. But ultimately, I've been finding that it never looks quite the way I want it to. It always looks a little bit tacked on. And I think that that's still fine, considering how much customizability there is and how much detail there is. If you're just really super obsessive about ship design and making it look absolutely perfect, it'll probably drive you a little bit nuts. But for like even at a fairly close glance, most of the time the ships in this game look pretty fantastic, and I'm just generally speaking happy with the way that they do it. Alright, so that's pretty much everything about the graphics and the sound. I'm going to do a quick cut here so that I can talk a little bit about the gameplay. Alright, so in terms of gameplay, after I've caught my breath and had a little bit of coffee, this game is pretty similar in scope and size and in tone in a lot of ways to something more like Civilization. You build your civilization cities in certain points and utilize the resources that you have around it. Unlike, say, Galactic Civilization, unlike Endless Space 2 or Stellaris, where there are certain sort of warp points that are led from one point to another, this is sort of more freeform. You can see that there's these little hex tiles sort of everywhere. So out of all of them, this is the one where it's most free in terms of where you can move. And it feels in that sort of sense a little bit more like a classical 4X type of strategy game, a little bit like Civilization or something like that. Obviously, the main difference as far as that goes is that where you can put colonies is a little bit more defined. You've got these very specific points where you're allowed to put a colony down. In that sort of sense, it's a little bit more like something like Stellaris. It's fairly restrictive in terms of which plants can be colonized. You can see that there's all these dead plants devoid of life. And considering how like far future this is supposed to be, it being devoid of life does not mean that you can't put a colony on it. Like, pre-existing life is not a precondition for a colony. But that is kind of how this game sort of has functioned here. Now, I don't particularly mind this setup, but there are some sort of there are some downsides to the way that they've structured it, and I can get into that in just a little bit here. But that is, generally speaking, the way that this game is played. It's a little bit of Civilization-like gameplay. You find the places where you can colonize those, you build up your resources, you consume the resources that are around or near you, and if those aren't exploitable by a colony, for example, like these ones in space here, then you get them via these constructors. It works in broadly that same sort of way there. And I think that this works fine. I think that this works in a lot of ways a little bit more intuitively than something like Stellaris, which I think is very unintuitive. It works pretty similar in terms of how easy it is to grasp and how easy it is to sort of move into with Endless Space 2, which I think is also fairly easy to comprehend with its sort of space lanes, which just lead you with nice, clear lines to another place that you'll almost always be able to colonize. This, I think, sort of has the one sort of problem, though, in that by being this free, there are certain elements of strategy that become a little bit nonsense. But it does make sense in the context of it being a space game where ships can sort of travel or traverse through anywhere they want. The other thing about the map, though, is that this really is not how a galaxy is structured in, like, even the most abstract of senses. The planets don't move around their suns, which is kind of fine. Like, I don't think they do in Stellaris either. In Endless Space 2, of course, the planets are sort of more clustered around a sun, and they're abstracted in the sense that if you've got a cluster of 4 habitable planets, you don't know where they are in relative relation to the sun. You don't see where they're moving, and rather than sort of individual colonization, you deal with solar systems as a whole. So that's kind of how they deal with it. This game, it feels really artificial, like it's kind of a map of space that's been painted on, and you're sort of moving through that map of space, rather than it being a real solar system. This does not at all feel as though this could be a real solar system. Whereas in Stellaris, because of the way that they've sort of structured it, even though the planets don't properly move, it does still give off that feeling like this could be the way that a real solar system is organized. So I think there is definitely some flaws with just translating the Civilization style of gameplay into space. The other thing about this game is the randomization of the way that colonies are distributed. When I was talking about how you can only colonize in very specific points in this game, that actually is a major, major flaw in my opinion. As you can see, we've got all these stars clustered around us. Now, I think I've still got planets set to rare or not necessarily that common in this particular playthrough, but that's fine. The problem with the way that it's structured, though, is that if I started the game and had a colonizable world, like, say, right here, and I have had games where I've started off, like, with one envision of my starting city, or my starting planet, then I can immediately go colonize that, and the benefits of that are humongous. And there's lots of little things that they do in terms of the random number generator, giving players big or small advantages. Now, in Stellaris, this isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, because in that game there are stacking cumulative penalties to having more than a small number of colonies. Now, obviously, if you're able to expand out to a large number of colonies, that's going to be potentially beneficial, and especially in terms of production capabilities, but you'll be lower in your technology and unity ratings. Whereas in this game, there doesn't seem to really be any penalty for colonizing loads of planets. So typically speaking, if I colonize loads of planets, I'm just going to be ahead flat out. By contrast, Endless Space 2, every solar system that you travel to is in some way or another colonizable. You just have to potentially get a tech. So there's no spawn where I've ever felt in Endless Space 2 that I didn't end up near a number of colonizable worlds. That just isn't how Endless Space 2 works. This game, however, not only is like Endless Space 2 in the sense that your colonies all directly benefit you and you always want to have more colonies than your opponents, this game also has that random element that Stellaris has. In Stellaris, if I don't have the good planets or good resources nearby me, I can opt to go tall and I can make that work. That is a functional gameplay style in Stellaris, with the ability to sort of move out after you've sort of gained an advantage through your technology, your superior technology. That doesn't happen in this game. In this game, if you are behind in planets, you're just behind in everything. And there's no reasonable way for you to catch up. There are ways for you, for example, through ideology to get some more planets, but you gain ideology points by getting planets. So if you need to go down that tree to get more planets because everyone else got those other planets, in all odds, they've got bonuses that are as good as those planets, or potentially they've just also got planets. These aren't mutually exclusive ones, by the way, so if everyone goes benevolent, you can end up with a lot of extra planets on the map. But still, that does mean that you're not only behind in a lot of ways, but you're never going to catch up over your opponent because they're getting all those bonuses in ways that you weren't able to. And this is the reason as well that I don't recommend playing this on godlike difficulty, because of how important that planetary bonus is to have access to. I think that to a large degree, this game is over generous in terms of what it lets you have when you're sort of founding planets and stuff like that. in a way that I think that they shouldn't. Intrigue expands on this a little bit. As you can see, once I've colonized a planet here, and it can be any planet, including your starting one, you get to choose your government, and being able to choose your government is also humongously beneficial. So being able to do this on turn 1 or turn 2, extremely, extremely powerful. And again, like, one of the things that I could have done is I could have had my ideology at this point in time if I had a real planet to sort of settle down near at the start here. Here's a planet over here. It's rank 12, and you can see that it's really, really close to these guys, so they'll probably colonize it before I can, but we're still going to have to try and get it because, again, it's just that much of an advantage to have access to these planets here. So yeah, I don't like the way that the random number generator is set up in this game. I think it is by far the worst of the three in terms of the random elements of the game. Not only are the elements of the random number generator harmful in terms of the way that planet colonization works, but the planets themselves are randomly generated with random resources on them. And this is to a degree done in Stellaris and in Endless Space 2 as well. But the resources in this game are far more impactful than they are in those games. And far more rare than they are in Endless Space 2. In Endless Space 2, like, I might be lucky and have my planet start with titanium and hyperium. In this game, I would be lucky to get, for example, thulium on my planet or something like that. There are far more resources in this game, and they are more rare than they are in Endless Space or Stellaris. Now, yes, the trade resources are rare in Endless Space 2, just like they are in this game, but at the same time, they're also a lot less meaningful. In this game, there are certain buildings, and some of them are very important buildings that can only be built using specific trade resources. Take, for example, the hypersilicates. They're used to build Brindle's Survey, and those are that's a building that allows you to sort of get access to another planet. So this is a very, very powerful thing to have access to. If one player starts off with it, they can sort of rush that. Whereas in Endless Space 2, the luxury resources are used for promoting different policies or different bonuses in your society, not a requirement for buildings that allow you to access wonders that are one-of-a-kind unique galactic wonders. The one-of-a-kind unique galactic wonders are built purely through the process of spending the build points to get it. And I think that system is a lot less dependent on the luck factor. Whereas this game, just every chance it has to make you rely on luck, it does it. It tries to force you to rely on luck as often as is possible, which I think is really something they could have done a better job with. Now, I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea that this game has elements of luck in it, period. Really. But in any event, what I tend to find in this game is that since there's so many different ways for luck to screw you over, it really detracts from the fun of the game in that sort of sense there. So I do think that this is a game where they probably should have toned that back down, or they should have done some other things for it. In this particular case, what I think they should have done in Endless Space 2 is I think they should have made it so that I'm capable of relying on luck, or I think that instead of relying on luck, they should have allowed you to, at the very least, customize your home system. So you can see that, generally speaking, within the radius of the sun, 3 tiles away from it, the sun here, there is a cluster of things that could be defined as the solar system. These are randomized. I think that if they had allowed you to have a certain amount of build points and customize what planets were here, including colonizable worlds, what asteroids were here, what Durantium resources were here, because oftentimes there's none, and what tiles were on your planet, where those tiles were organized, and what resources they had on them, I think this could make for a much more compelling and smooth opening gameplay experience that didn't rely as heavily on that sort of element of luck. You would still have to find these random planets elsewhere, and that could still screw you over. I think that there should be some weighting to the randomization of the system, rather than being true random. I think that true random systems are never a good idea in video games. But weighted random systems are generally supposed to be a lot better. Basically, true random is you could potentially find that, for example, this entire corner of the, like, everything over on the left of where I'm drawing out here has no planets, and every single colonizable planet is in this little cluster here. That's possible in a true random world, and there's nothing interesting about that happening whatsoever. That could also be less extreme, where it's just like, say, this patch here has every single planet that's colonizable in the map, and it's just packed into this small area here. And that's also not interesting. Okay, like, if it's sort of at a non-random distribution where they're sort of evenly spread throughout the galaxy with maybe a slightly denser patch over here, that becomes much more compelling to actually play in. true random is not the way to go in these sort of circumstances. It works in Endless Space 2 and it works in Stellaris to a greater or lesser extent because colonizing worlds is easier in Endless Space 2. Like, if I were to move over to this sun, I'd be guaranteed to get some colonizable worlds in Endless Space 2. Maybe I can't colonize them right away, but I can definitely make a move to colonize them with a little bit of tech. And no one else is going to go for this star system because they're thinking about this star system or this star system or this star system. And, you know, I've got plenty of places that I can expand to. That's not the case in this game. In Stellaris, it's possible to go tall and be successful using that tall strategy. That is not really that possible in this game. It is possible, but it's not very practical, I don't find. There's literally no advantage to not colonizing in this game, as far as I've been able to tell. So that's my sort of biggest gripe about the way that this gameplay works. I think that this is one of those games where they definitely would be better off if they had done something to consolidate that. But in any event, let's go from here into some elements of the combat. For that, I'm going to be moving into another gameplay, so I'll be right back in just a little bit. Okay, and here we are. Now we can really get into sort of the meat of things here. So, in terms of gameplay, combat is one of those things that I think is the most intriguing elements of this game. There are plenty of other little bits that go around it, but I think that if you're playing one of these kinds of games and you don't get to batter other spaceships with your spaceships, something's gone horribly wrong. So, let's take a quick look at combat here. So this is a save of my godlike difficulty game. In this particular case, we're at war with the Iconians, which is going... It's honestly going pretty well. But let's take a look at how combat is. So this is what a fleet looks like on that sort of grander scale there. This is a bunch of large to huge ships here. And it looks really, really good, but you can see what I was talking about. These ships look very disparate from one another. You could almost think that they didn't come from the same faction as those other ships that I had earlier. But that's fine. That really doesn't matter all that much there. So I don't think I can move right now. I'm pretty sure I have to hit end turn first. Yeah, so we'll get to that in a little bit. So basically, the game's combat system is a bit unfortunate, and despite that, it's still a pretty good-looking combat system. The way it works is essentially a cutscene auto-resolve, unlike, say, Stellaris, where you've got the ability to actually influence it by having other ships fly in because it's in real time, or to warp out spontaneously. And it also doesn't contain that sort of element of real strategy or tactics in Endless Space 2 because of the ability to sort of select what it is that your ships are going to be doing. So let's go ahead and hit end turn here. These guys will probably go off and kill something or something like that. I don't really know. Look at this ship. How far can this guy go? Pretty goddamn far. $133 tiles. Fucking amazing. Anyway, this is why I don't like godlike. Anyway, yeah, so the unfortunate part about this game is really just that. It's the fact that this is really just an auto-resolve system with no real tactical input. Both Stellaris and Endless Space 2 could be said to be an auto-resolve system, and in a very real sense they kind of are. But at the same time, Endless Space 2 does give you that input of letting you select which lanes, where those ships are going to be relative to one another, and what all of your fleet is going to be doing. That actually makes it much more interesting in terms of that sort of tactical element. And again, because of the real-time nature of Stellaris, you can actually have ships fly in as reinforcements from a flank or something like that. You can have clever traps where you've got a small fleet in one location designed to bait an enemy fleet into a position so that your larger fleet can warp in on top of them. All of these things can be done in Stellaris, and it adds a sort of layer of strategic or tactical depth. Unfortunately, in this game, since everything is auto-resolve and is essentially all or nothing, like you can see that my fleet here got wiped out, there is no tie as far as I've been able to discern in this game, or if there is, it's under some system that is so obfuscated that it just never happens. But what happens in this game is you clash your fleet against their fleet, and one fleet emerges the victor. Quite often I find as well that the fleet that wins does not take substantial or significant losses. There's very few close battles in this game. So let's go ahead and take a gander at us attacking these guys here. So you'll see that my numbers and my attack value ballooned outwards. That's because I've got carriers in this fleet here. And we've got the victory is certain sort of indicator. And I think that this is useful because the game is a little bit clunky as far as figuring out whether a ship is going to win or not. But I think that hiding this or making it so I didn't get this before I clicked on the enemy fleet would also potentially be useful. You can go through the enemy ships individually here and figure out what's going on with each individual ship in their fleet there. And there's a sort of weapon triangle in this game here. They've got the beam weapons, the missile weapons, and the kinetic weapons. The unfortunate thing is that these don't interact with each other all that much, but they interact rather with the defenses. Beams are blocked by lasers, missiles are blocked by chaff, kinetics are blocked by armor. There's really nothing to choosing one of these other than picking the weapon type that your opponent isn't blocking. Whereas in something like, say, Stellaris, there's a little bit more going on behind whether or not you're going to use one weapon or another based on the types of weapons that your opponent is using. Just because that carriers work differently, I find it makes a bigger difference there. And also sort of the defense types work across each other a little bit better in Stellaris. And in Endless Space 2, of course, whether or not you're using kinetics or missiles is going to depend on whether your opponent's using missiles. You'll use kinetics if your opponent is using missiles, because then you can block his missiles. If you're just worried about causing damage no matter what range you're at, you want to use the beams. If you want to have sort of a higher damage output period, you want to use the lasers. So if you're using one weapon type, you can counter another weapon type in Endless Space 2 to a certain degree, I find. The missiles are amazing against people who are using the lasers, I find, or of beam or sort, or the middle range ones as well. I find the beams are really great just as a general damage per second weapon. For a more versatile fleet in particular, and I find the mid-range lasers to be pretty decent if you manage to get your distances exactly right, because there are very few other weapon systems in the game that are as high damage as them when you're at the mid-range there. So the weapons in this game are all just absolute based on range. The missiles have the longest range, the beams have the sort of mid-range, and the kinetics have the shortest range, and the shorter range of the weapon is the more damage per second they do. So it doesn't really interact with each other in any sort of meaningful or interesting way. Anyway, let's go ahead and just view the battle here. So I think that the battles in this game look really good and really interesting, and customizing and designing your fleets so that they can match against each other and be effective or be interesting to watch is one of the real joys of this game. It's got pretty good viewers here. We can go top-down, cinematic, which brings us right into the action. I don't find it pans quite as well as the Endless Space 2 one, but it does a pretty good job of showing good angles and stuff like that. The information is just a little bit more confusing. We can go to follow, where it will follow an individual ship. We can go with the orbital, where it just pans around one of them. And I'm not necessarily sure actually how the target one differs from follow. It really does look like just a follow. But in any event, that's the whole sort of battle system there. I don't use the free one very often because it's kind of janky. I like cinematic personally. Yeah, let's take a look here at what happened there. So I received 6 damage in total, and they received 1,397. And the reasons why this has happened is a little bit transparent. This game's not necessarily the most clear in terms of presenting that kind of information. We can see here what's going on to a certain extent here, because it tells you what every single shot in the battle is doing. And what happens with all these misses is that my ships here with the long-range missiles all open fire in around there, and since they're doing enough damage in a single shot to destroy one of their small ships, I think it probably is one of these interceptors here with a tiny hull. Since it's enough to instantly destroy it, the other shots automatically miss. So I think that's what's happening here. They fire back at me with their interceptor there and miss. And the reason that that's happening is because I've got an evasion rating of 125% in this particular fleet. They have an accuracy over 100%. That's why they've still got a chance to hit me. So again, we fire one shot and destroy one of the ships. All the remaining shots miss. And the same thing sort of happens back and forth, and you can see definitely that they have no real hope of hitting me with anything. And yeah, that's kind of the state of the way that things go. One of their storm ships managed to hit one of my ships with a missile just by pure chance. Another one gets hit by a missile by pure chance there, and managed to get through. Actually, no, they hit the chaff. You can actually see as well that the defense holds there. And we get tons of more misses and just go through the whole damn thing here. And lots of his ships are getting sort of destroyed. You can see the strings of my ships hitting their large ones. So it does give you a very detailed feedback as to why things are going the way they're going. It's a little too late, though, in a lot of cases, where it's like you get into the situation, it's like, okay, well, that would have been fantastic to know before I got friggin' wrecked. But in this particular case, it is kind of the way it is here. And you can see all of these ships sort of opening fire, dealing humongous amounts of damage and sort of destroying this ship pretty quickly. And yeah, because of the way that the combat sort of works here, because my ships had bare defenses, they took 0 damage, whereas his fleet got wiped out. And I find that this is pretty typical in this game. So, out of all 3 of the games, this one has by far the least satisfying combat in terms of the strategy and the tactics. What this game does do pretty well is the look of the battles and the sort of the feel of them. The one thing that's missing is that the ships that are classified as fighters, all these little ships here that we're following right now, are very static. They just sort of fly straight forward, and they don't really have a lot going on to make them more interesting about that. So everything just sort of flies in a straight line forward. They sort of weave around a little bit, but not very much. And they sort of just spam out a humongous amount of firepower, which looks pretty interesting when you think about it, but I would like to see the fighters, of course, engaging in sort of more what looks like dogfighting, or more inherently like them actually doing some real piloting. You can actually see that instance of Solar Empire, and that one's in real time, so I definitely feel as though that could be something they do with the small and tiny hulled ships in this game. Despite that, though, I think this game looks better by a long shot than Stellaris. I think Stellaris has the worst looking combat system out of these. I still really like the look and aesthetic of Stellaris' combat system, but it really does feel like just blobs mashing against each other with lots of bright, flashy lights. This still looks a little bit like that, but it's a tiny bit more cohesive. My favorite of them in terms of appearance is Endless Space 2. I really love that sort of broadside style of battle that one represents, and it's a little bit unique as well, since that's not typically what you see. You typically see ships flying straight at each other nose first, which I don't really think looks as visually interesting there. So one of the things about this game in terms of the balance of it is that this one fleet can basically wipe out an endless number of their fleets. Not only because it has enough movement to go from fleet to fleet to fleet, destroying a ton of their ships without really any regards for the sanity of what would normally happen under these circumstances, but since I take, broadly speaking, 0 damage from each of these engagements, and those ships that took 6 damage on my side in that last battle, they're actually repaired to full as well because I've got regenerative hull tissue. Because of the way this game is structured, my ships are going to continue going through each of those fleets while taking 0 damage and just snowball the way through the entire game. And that's kind of actually how this game ended. This is the godlike game that I actually finished. So there's very little tension once you manage to get the right fleet composition, and this is where I think that this game's sort of AI is to blame for a lot. The game's AI cannot, for the life of it, develop a compelling or interesting fleet. And you can see here we again received 6 damage, but did not lose any ships. The game cannot build a functional fleet. I can build multiple different types of fleets using different styles, different weapon types, and I've been able to completely roll over the AI in any of those scenarios. Even in godlike difficulty, because the AI does not fundamentally understand how to structure their fleets. Now, it's kind of a good thing that they do. Those gigantic stacks that my opponent actually is throwing against me are surprisingly common. It's very, very easy for the AI to just chuck fleets of that size against me. And to actually win this game, you, to a certain extent, need to have fleets constructed that are capable of just walking through enemy ships there. So let's go into the ship designer and take a look at the sort of secondary thing that makes this game really stand out and really special here. So this game has unprecedented ship customization for this genre as far as I'm aware. There may be games that are in the 4X genre that have more customization, but I don't know what they are. So in any event, let's take a look here at the designer. They've got a fairly huge number of different hulls. You can actually go in and edit each of the hulls with more crap. I can go in here and add, say, this little fin here to the back of the ship here if I wanted to. And it doesn't necessarily look good. Well, actually, that's not the worst thing in the world. But you can sort of fiddle around with this until you've got it just right and have it exactly customized the way you want it to. And I think that actually is just amazing. I think that this probably has probably got the best ship customizer on the market there. What's more, since you're not limited to specific snap points, if you want to just, for example, take the lightest weapon that we've got here, which is this basic railgun here, and slap however many we can on here. How many have we got? So, okay, so we've managed to put 11 guns on this ship here. There's no other game that I know of that lets you just all or nothing a ship in that capacity, in that way. Just using every single slot there on weapons, every single bit of capacity. And that's one of the things that I really like about the weight and hull size system that this game uses. The fact that you're able to customize your ships so that they are pure offense rather than having to use specific slots for specific things like you do in Stellaris and in Endless Space 2 gives you really great freedom in making ships the way that you want them to act. And even if this design is really stupid, it's kind of interesting that that's something that I'm able to do. And of course, like that's a design that I would use if I was just going for kinetics. Kinetics have the lightest weight and the best damage ratios. If I was actually using this with the sort of style that I currently got here, what I'd probably be using is, say, well, maybe the harpoon, actually. I think it would be the harpoon. Yeah, so, oops, no, this is, where the hell's the actual damage on this thing? Oh, there it is, yeah. So I can fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I can only fit 7 missiles on there. It's 28 damage, but like you could have this ship loitering at like the sort of farther range. You could have it sort of as a support type ship, so that's lower on the attack priority list. The enemy's less likely to attack it as compared to your escorts. And what the ship will do is it'll just sort of spam out a humongous crap ton of missiles and instantly blow something up potentially. And that's really glorious, the fact that you can sort of do that. Now, the system does break away in its execution in the balance sense. Despite the fact that this game allows you that sort of huge amount of freedom, there are certain modules in this game that I think are way too strong. So let's take a look at this field generator. This creates a basic shield system for every ship in my fleet here. So let's chuck this on the back here. I think that they tend to look good back here. And this gives my ship 5 shields, but this is actually giving my ship and every other ship I have 5 shields. You'll notice that weighs 13 tons there, and we can compare it to a shield generator. So let's throw a shield generator on there. Well, that gave me 3 shields, and it weighs 7 tons. So if I get 2 of them, I'm now at about the same weight there. We're just a little bit heavier than that other one. We've got 6 shields, which looks a little bit better, but then you realize that I've got, like, say, 10 ships in a fleet maybe, and all 10 of those have those field generators. Well, that means actually all my ships have 50 shields, because all of them are getting the overlapping bonuses from that. So I don't think that necessarily the game does a great job at dealing with these stackable generators, these field type things. And I think that actually the game's balance is not necessarily thrown off too terribly by these types of systems. If I go for tons of field generators on all my ships as well as all the other disruptor type things, it means that the battles are going to take a little bit longer to resolve, yes, because both sides have humongous defenses, but at the same time, both sides could also then have something like, say, the beam magnification array or the missile guidance array, which increases the damage conversely. So all the ships not only have the increased defense, but they also all have that increased damage. Now, where this falls apart is that there really is no reason for me to go ahead and grab, say, the titanium, the shield generators or the point defense. These things I'm far better off getting through those shared modules. Now, the titanium plating is a little bit different. You don't get any base shielding or base armor from its equivalent, so if I wanted to have an armor bonus at all, I do actually have to get the titanium plating. The other thing just increases the value that I already have by, say, 50% or whatever value that module happens to be. So titanium plating is a bit of an exception, but the defense against kinetics being really crappy is actually an inbuilt part of the balance, because kinetic weapons are kind of the worst of all the weapons there, so the attack against them is also the worst. But in any event, that kind of does mean that this game does have a couple redundant things, like why would I bother building anything in these 2 lines? Which is a shame, because I think that having access to those, having access to, say, these sublight thrusters, which give me a little bit of an evasion chance, or to these support modules for the evasive thruster AI, any of those things could be on their own really quite interesting, but they're always overshadowed by their area of effect equivalent. It's pretty much always just better outright to get the long-range army-wide versions of these effects, and I don't think that this is actually a huge hit again to the balance of the game. I do think that they could potentially do something like, say for example, we take a look at the field disruption unit here. This one gives every ship in the fleet dodge percent. It gives it 25%. I think that this would be much more interesting if this gave you, say, 25%, and the evasion array, which is the single ship version of it, gave you 50%, for example. So these, or even like 10% on the jamming field and 50% on the evasion array. You'd have to have a humongous disparity between the single ship version of a module and the multiple ship version of the module. We can say the same thing for these beam augment things. I think we've got a damage one. Maybe we don't actually have a damage one. I can't remember. All right, so these don't increase damage outright, so that's fine. But if there was a damage module in here, it would have to be substantially stronger than the area of effect one before it actually was better than the area of effect one, unless it had some other sort of downside. But we can take a look at even this field disruptor here. The field disruptor weighs 13 tons, and this thing weighs 17 tons. The evasion array actually weighs more. The sensor cost here, this thing costs 39.1 for the field disruptor. and the evasion rate over here costs 65 to produce. It costs more to produce the stupid evasion array. Like, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that that's balanced. And there's lots of little examples of that where they could tweak the numbers to make it better, but at the same time, I don't really mind necessarily that. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that's useless and that you don't need to worry about that's in the game. That's fine. I think that you can sort of get by that, just realize that some of the stuff in this game is not useful. The other problem, though, is that the AI cannot comprehend what to do when I stack field disruption, for example, or when I stack loads of field generators and missile disruptors. If I stack enough field generators and missile disruptors, do they go to kinetics? Maybe they do, but if they do that, and I've gone for a missile swarm tactic where I can just one-shot all of his ships before he even gets anywhere near close enough to me, and especially if I'm doing that and I'm using like wake disruptors to make it so that he doesn't have any sort of, or what's it called? Stasis field module? I can't remember. There's a type of module that I might not have access to that decreases tactical speeds of the enemy ships, but yeah, I don't think I have access to that tech. But anyway, let's say that I've got all that stuff and I've reduced his speed down to basically 0. I can just pound him with missiles from long distance without ever worrying about retaliation from those kinetic weapons. And his ships will all die before it really matters that he sort of has that ability to penetrate through my shields and my chaff launchers. And because of this, if I'm against a human opponent, it's possible for them to sort of realize that I've got lots of these field disruptors and counter that by taking loads of these subspace targeting grids. So we end up in a sort of equilibrium because they're kind of equal opposite each other. I think that this is one of those cases where the targeting ray should probably be stronger than the jamming field personally, but that's just my personal instinct on that notion. There's also, of course, like there's an accuracy thing. The missile guidance system increases like the accuracy of missiles by 50%. So if you're going for the missile strategy and you've taken like, say, this arrangement here, there's no amount of targeting of jamming that an opponent could take that could possibly cripple your ability to hit them. You will hit them. And this is only 40 out of 144 weight, so this is not that difficult an arrangement. But yeah, like for fighting the AI, this all really crumbles down because the AI cannot comprehend this and the AI cannot counter this in the same way that a human potentially can or could. So on paper, this is balanced. If the AI was set up so that it could comprehend how to counter this, it would be balanced. But the game isn't really designed for that to be easily comprehended by the AI. The algorithm that they're using doesn't really realize just how effective the jamming fields and the area of effect buffs really are. So you'll often find that the AI struggles against your fleets. And this is why it's so easy for me to create a small doom stack that really just wipes out tons and tons of the enemy fleets, which is satisfying in its own sort of way. But I think that if they wanted to give this game a real challenge to it, they would have the AI really understand how to use these stacking effects and really prioritize those in a much more intelligible way. And if they're going to do that, I think they would have to really scale down the advantages that the AI is given on godlike difficulty because their productive bonuses are too extreme. If they actually had really good ship designs as well, it would be literally impossible to beat them. They would be able to crush you on turn like 50. So beyond that, though, let's take one last look at one more thing that I want to talk about in terms of this game. The reason that this game is so slow and so boring to watch is because it's really easy to attack planets. And that might sound a bit counterintuitive, but let's go over that a little bit in more detail. So let's say that I was playing Civilization 4. Civilization 4 also has that problem where if I have the city that's ungarrisoned over here, just sort of out in the open, an enemy ship an enemy could just go into the village and take it over. That would be sort of how that works in Civilization 4. In Civilization 5 and 6, they've got hit points on cities and they've got the ability to defend themselves to a limited degree, and they automatically damage some units that attack them. All of that means that it takes a little bit of time for an enemy to actually kill your city, and it allows you to bring troops in to potentially reinforce it or to destroy those units that are attacking your city, or otherwise drive them away, or make it so that by the time he has actually taken your city, it's really easy for you to take it back. Any of those things are possible in those sorts of games. And in this game, you can do the last strategy, you can take your city back, potentially. But it's impossible to actually defend your cities. In Civilization 4, the reason that this system worked was because armies had a movement range of maybe like going from here into your city. At a sort of faster paced army could go from like this many tiles away into the city over here. And even then, more often it would be an army stack would be over here, and they'd be able to move from here into the city. In this game, my army here has a movement speed of 48. I can move from... We'll reset my movement by moving over like this here. So this is my starting point. And this is my end point over here. This is literally about half the map. This is about half the map here in a single turn that I'll be able to cover. So the problem with this is that if I've got to transport an invasion fleet, I can move my ships so far across the map and take this planet from so far away that it is utterly impossible to have definitive, comprehensive knowledge that you can definitely see that attack coming and have the ability to actually intercept it. And if I wanted to intercept it, I would have to have these guys inside the planet. There's no zone of control. So if I had a ship over here, what would happen is he'd simply go around it and into the planet and take it over. Like, this does nothing. I have to have them on the planet itself. If I did have them on this planet over there, then this planet's open. So I can't have my planets defended in this game. So the reason that this game ends up being so goddamn slow is because I have to have each of these points here defended by a large garrison fleet. And you can see that a lot of my planets do have large garrison fleets. A couple of these guys had their fleets destroyed, or I just got lazy or whatever, and those planets are extremely vulnerable, and quite often the AI does take these and I have to take them back. This is a humongous negative to watching the game, in my opinion. Now, it's not as extreme on higher difficulties, but on even lower difficulties, they can easily get ships that can move pretty far distances, 12 tiles pretty easily. And I think that you could probably move from, say, like here to here, and threaten, again, both of these planets. And the only way I could really beat that fleet as it's coming into approach is if I've got a faster fleet defending that can sort of run out and beat it up from a further distance. This is really not conducive to watching an interesting Let's Play, because to effectively play the game, I have to spend so many goddamn turns building up fleets of these small ships, of these small fleets. And since, as I showed you earlier, the battles are very all or nothing, based around entirely one fleet completely dominating the others, you can't cheap out on these defensive garrison fleets. If your defensive garrison fleets are too bad, they just lose and don't cause enough damage to stop anything. It's possible for an opponent to run in, beat up a defensive fleet that's really weak, and then invade the planet. And you can see that I can pretty much show you an example of that sort of here. This is a slightly slower fleet because they destroyed one of my support ships, but like, let's say I want to attack over here. It's got too many legions defending for me to actually beat it, because I was waiting to get more soldiers, I think. Yeah, we've only got 6 legions, but yeah, in terms of movement, I could actually just run up to this planet here, take out its garrison fleet, and then invade the planet in the same turn. So, like, defending these places requires really good garrisons. Like, they've got these tiny ships here, these fighter class ships here. He's got a couple medium-hulled ships there that are pretty bad. And he's got these fighters here as well. So this is a really cheap fleet composed of primarily cheap and poor quality ships. I lost nothing in that engagement there. And now I'm allowed to also engage in ground warfare on that same turn. I can't win because, like I said, I haven't got the legions for it right now. But the fact that that is such a huge threat means that you can't defend your planets unless you've got a fleet that's capable of winning against an enemy fleet in each planet. That takes time. That takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of planning. And against the harder AI, they have to defeat like 10, 20 different fleets without reinforcement. Like, the number of ships that you have to have that are capable of just wiping enemy fleets out, the number of compositions that you have to have that are just completely capable of wiping out the enemy is ridiculous. Like, it takes so long to develop and build up that kind of defensive network that, realistically speaking, you're just sitting here hitting end turn a lot of the game, and then suddenly burst out once you finally got all your places defended and have an offensive fleet. Once you've managed to do both those things, you can actually go on the offense. Like, I think that what this game really needs is a zone of control mechanic. Like, let's take this fleet over here. If in my sort of ideal system, like, at the start of the game, a fleet automatically engages enemies that are within one tile of it. So anything that moves directly adjacent to me would have to fight this fleet. And if I position them here, that means that this planet's defended, this station's defended, and this shipyard's defended, since I would, reinforce those things. That's sort of also how this would have to work. And then this could be something that you could upgrade with text. You could have an interception range so that anything within this circle is defended. Or even, you could have it such that it literally is just, you could have to have a no man's zone where it slows them down in the early game, where they have to sort of go all the way around your ships. So let's say they're approaching the south here, they have to go around here to avoid engaging my ships so that they can attack my shipyard. In the early game, that would be acceptable because the ships are slower. But in the late game, now that I've got a much wider net, let's say that it's a 3-tile net in the late game, he can't attack this planet without encountering this guy's engagement net. So I could have one fleet defending a planet, a station, and a shipyard. 2 planets, a station, and a shipyard. I could have perhaps just 3 fleets around here to defend all this. It would cut down the number of ships that you have to defend a small area, allowing you to sort of build up to that point where you can actually do something interesting much more quickly. The alternative is they dramatically scale back the bonuses that the AI has, but since the player is also capable of getting ships that are this fast, it's not really a cheat that the AI has ships that are that fast. It's just an elemental part of the way that this game is designed. Now, there are ways to slow down fleets. You can have fields that reduce the speed of ships by 25%. I think you could actually have them technically force ships to go to a dead stop, but I'm not entirely sure about the mechanics behind that. I'd have to actually do a test or something like that to check how that works. But broadly speaking, I think the biggest reason that this game is let down in terms of watchability is that very slow, deliberate, thoughtful kind of play that you have to engage in, realizing that everything is vulnerable all the time. Now, when you're actually playing the game, this is not necessarily a problem. There are certain types of players who I think that's going to work for, and I'm one of them. I really like having to think individual garrisons for each individual place that I build myself. It's just that it takes 100+ turns to develop that. And the one that you developed 100 turns ago is so radically and poorly optimized for whatever modern combat that you're getting into that you kind of have to radically redesign all the ships. And since like this game is relentless in terms of like upgrade cost, like let's say that I want to upgrade the Bringer of Fire here to the distinct to really any other type of ship here, like the most modern version of the same type of ship, which is still crap. This ship is still, like, the new type of ship here that I'm upgrading this to is still absolute shit here. This cost me 2,661 of the currency in this game. So you cannot upgrade your fleets. So by the time you've actually built up your defenses, you know, those defenses are obsolete and you have to scrap them all to get new defenses. Like, it's ridiculous. But it is an interesting puzzle when you're trying to figure out what your ships are going to be designed for, knowing that they're going to be obsoleted and that you can't replace them. Like, that part's actually kind of an interesting element to the game in deciding how you're going to design these ships. It's a good puzzle. So in any event, though, that's my take on this game here. There's a lot of things that are very frustrating and very much, I think, need to change to make it a better game. But what is still here is a really fantastic game for the right kind of player. And you do have to be the right kind of player, I think, to get into this game and really enjoy it. So in any event, that's going to be my review of this one. I think it falls somewhere in between Stellaris and Endless Space 2 in a lot of respects there. I do think it is a little bit more conventional in terms of both of them. It is the most conventional of the three of them, despite that. You can think of it as Galactic Civilizations 3 took the center position, and then Stellaris and Endless Space 2 both went off in opposite directions from that. And I think that that's sort of how that works. But despite that, this is also probably the most fiddly of the three games there, with I think Endless Space 2 being the most beginner-friendly, and I think Stellaris being actually fairly exciting for a player who's not deeply entrenched in the 4X genre. So in any event, I hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.